The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents, Is Anything Really Possible? So we've all heard the phrase, anything's possible. And I'm pretty sure none of us believe it's true. I'm pretty sure we all figured out really early on that anything isn't really possible. But in some debates that I've had, where I tried to point out that science is prohibited from investigating the supernatural, that we have no mechanism to confirm the existence of the supernatural, nor could we confirm that the supernatural can interact with the natural world, I've had opponents, or at least one opponent, say, but anything is possible. And I tried to point out, we all know that's not true. No, he means, in a philosophical sense, everything should be considered possible until it's proven impossible. And I looked at him and said, no, we know that's wrong too. And we started to have this argument. We sidelined it. I hope to have it with him in the future. Or maybe I'll just point him to this video and this will solve it all. Because when you say that anything is possible until it's been proved impossible, what are you saying? My understanding of the burden of proof allows for us to have default positions, but those default positions are not what some people think they are. For example, it's true that everything is either possible or impossible. Those are the only two possibilities for possible and impossible. But that doesn't mean that we have any way of telling whether something is possible or impossible. We don't just get to assume that it's one or the other. It would be dishonest. And the truth is, those are two separate propositions that are claims that have their own burden of proof. So if you want to say, this is possible, you have to make the case for that and demonstrate that it is in fact possible. Similarly, if you want to say, this is impossible, you've adopted a burden of proof and you need to make that claim. When we talk about things like a courtroom where somebody is guilty, or somebody's innocent until proven guilty, where we talk about the presumption of innocence, we are not declaring that they are in fact innocent until we prove them guilty. We are demonstrating that guilt is the issue we're going to address, and we will either find them guilty or not. And the burden of proof is on those who are claiming that it's guilty. We could have a court system, by the way, where we assume that because you've been charged, you're probably guilty, and you then have to prove your innocence. And then what we would have is rulings from juries that say, we find the defendant innocent, or we define the defendant not innocent. We still wouldn't necessarily find them guilty because that wasn't the issue that was addressed. It's a strange situation because I've had conversations both with the person I'm talking to and other debaters where I get them to acknowledge, is something true just because it hasn't been proved false? And they'll say no. Oh, well, is something false just because it hasn't been proved true? And again, they will say no. And I'm like, you're correct. So how is it that you can sit there and look at me in response and say, something is possible until it's been proved impossible? And they will try to use the courtroom example, you're assuming innocence. No, I'm not assuming innocence. I'm just setting the burden of proof on guilt. And we do this for very good and obvious reasons. The idea that it's better for, 100 guilty people to go free than for one innocent person to be imprisoned. There are practical reasons why we do that. And also because you can demonstrate guilt, you may not be able to demonstrate innocence. You can build a strong case. You could have video evidence, which could be tampered with, but it's pretty strong. I don't know that you can necessarily, in all cases, demonstrate innocence. It's very rare for courts to make any kind of ruling on innocence. But simply because something hasn't been proved false doesn't mean it's true. Pick anything like that. Simply because something hasn't been demonstrated to be red doesn't mean it's green. In that case, now we're talking about red and green. That's not a true dichotomy. And so we know that possible and impossible is, and true and false are at least within the bounds of things that have a truth value. As we go through these things and we try to establish what the burden of proof is, the thing that people seem to miss is that the burden of proof is on any positive claim. Some God exists, you have a burden of proof. No gods exist, you have a burden of proof. This is why there's so much confusion about the atheist term, because, does it really mean non-theism? Is it weak atheism, the I don't believe? Is it strong atheism, the I believe there are no gods? It's all of those things, and it's a mess that we have to do some work to clear out. When you talk about the burden of proof, if you've made a positive claim, you have a burden of proof. Now, you may not want to satisfy it. You may not be interested at all in convincing anybody, but I am. And I primarily engage in debates with people who are also trying to convince me in return. Anything is possible is this tired old canard that is more useful as a tool to express hope and optimism than it is anything factual about whether something is actually possible. It betrays our hopes about possibility more than facts about possibility. It is, to paraphrase Dan Dennett, a deepity. A deepity is something that, to the extent that it's true, it's trivial, and to the extent that it's profound, it's actually false. So, possible and impossible have a burden of proof. And yet, my debate opponents still want to say, no, you're getting it wrong. Everything is possible. You have to show that it's impossible. I don't even know that you could show that something is impossible in the realm of what we're talking about when it comes to a God. Because it's easy to prove that something is possible. You do it, you demonstrate it, you show it. But it's not necessarily easy, or perhaps it may not be possible, to show that it's impossible. I know this might get confusing when I start multiplying possibilities and impossibilities. But if what we see in modern religions, for them to be successful, they need to have an appeal to people, have something that's relevant to their life, or perhaps an afterlife. They have to have perhaps hopeful information about things that we really don't know, right? It's so discomforting to say, I don't know, that it's easier to grab on to the religions who claim they do know and run with that. And when it comes to this idea of possible or impossible, it's almost automatic that people would adopt this view of, well, anything's possible, so a God's possible. But is it? Do we have any reason to believe that the supernatural actually exists or even could possibly exist? We know that there are things that can't exist, at least within the realm of our understanding. And if we start reaching outside the realm of what we understand, we can't say anything at all about it. We don't have any access to it to verify whether it's possible or impossible. So it becomes this exercise in optimism. It becomes this exercise in, I really want this to be the case more than this is the case. How could you possibly demonstrate that it's impossible for there to be a God? Especially when religions are offering unfalsifiable propositions. Falsifiability is a key cornerstone of critical thinking, scientific investigation, skepticism, in which what you propose has to be something that we could at least theoretically demonstrate is wrong. If there's no way to show that your proposition is wrong, it is useless. It is an irrelevant proposition. And what religions do is they make their claims just specific enough so that they might appear to be useful, and vague enough so that they cannot be falsified. Then there's no need to demonstrate that they're actually true, because you can constantly say, well, you can't prove I'm wrong. You can't disprove this. Can you prove a universal negative? Boy, you hear that all the time. Well, you can't prove a negative. Yes, you can. You can prove all kinds of negatives. Hey, there's a body in the trunk of my car, or there's not a body in the trunk of my car. I can go out and look. We can prove some negative statements. They just have to be specific enough. But a universal negative, the problem may be that in order to have access to enough information to be able to demonstrate that this is not the case, you would have to have godlike knowledge of everything in the universe. I can't demonstrate that there's, not a teapot in Alpha Centauri or whatever. It's a logical mistake, because in a syllogism, we have one conclusion. There is one proposition in question, not two. As soon as you start adding two, you increase the likelihood that you have started off with a false dichotomy. Well, is it this or is it this? What if there's other options? The only question that matters is it this? And then we can either say, yes, we have good reason to believe that this is the case, or no, we don't have good reason to believe this is the case. And if we don't have good reason to believe that it's actually the case, that does not necessarily mean that we have good reason to think that it's false. This is why this is so confusing, because in general, in our colloquial everyday speech, things are true or false. When you're talking about logic, generally we say, things are true or false. I prefer true and not true. Because then when you get to things like liar's paradox, this sentence is false, and then if it's false, it's true, and if it's true, it's false, and oh my gosh, we got a contradiction. I say, this sentence is false is not true. It's also not false. It doesn't have a truth value. And so if you have true and not true and false and not false, you're on much safer terms to be clear about what you're saying. But it still causes confusion. In logic, you also have the hypothetical view versus the existential view. The hypothetical view determines truth values that are kind of for the sake of argument truth values. Like fairies have wings is true in the hypothetical view, but it's not true or false in the existential view because fairies aren't real. Ooh, fairies aren't real? He just made a claim fairies aren't real. He's got a burden of proof to demonstrate it. You're right. And this is where we get into the difference between what we say in everyday speech, fairies aren't real, and what we really mean. I have no good reason to believe that fairies are real. And every occasion on which we've investigated fairies, we've failed to come up with evidence to support them. But absence of evidence isn't evidence for absence. Yes, it is. It's not absolute confirmation of absence, but the absence of evidence where we would expect to find evidence. If you say, I've got a pet cat, and I come to your house, and there's no cat food, there's no litter box, there's no cat hairs on anything, all of your furniture is intact, pretty good reason to conclude you probably aren't telling the truth about having a cat. Maybe you mean something entirely different by cat. Mermaids, pixies, those things in the hypothetical view, we can make true statements about them. In the existential view, we at least cannot make true statements about them. So which category does God fit into? Ooh, that hurts. Because if we're going to talk about it in the hypothetical view, then I would have to acknowledge that in the hypothetical view, God is all-powerful is true. Because there's some hypothetical God that has this characteristic. And so if we want to speak hypothetically, we can do. I don't care about hypothetically when we're talking about reality. I care about the existential view. And if you say that God is all-powerful, and you only mean that in the hypothetical view, we have no quarrel. It's when you bring that into the existential view that we begin to have a quarrel. And now you have made a claim about something in reality, even if what you're claiming is supposedly existing outside of reality, but you have a burden of proof to demonstrate them. And if we consider that these things are non-existent, why is, if our default everyday language is not, I do not have sufficient evidence to think that fairies are real, it's fairies aren't real. And yet when it comes to God, because there are so many people who believe this, I have to use language like, I do not have sufficient evidence to believe that a God exists. I have to do that in order to be clear to the Christian philosophical nitpickers and the Muslim philosophical nitpickers and all of the other theological philosophical nitpickers who want to say, oh, well, you just claimed that God doesn't exist. I understand. I get it. You're right. I should say, I don't have good reason to believe that a God exists. You're absolutely right. And when I talk to you, that's exactly what I'll say. But when I'm talking to the people in this room, I'm okay with saying, yeah, God's not real. By the way, the claim God's not real could be interpreted as God has not been demonstrated to be real, in which case I'm still correct. But when they say God is possible until you show that he isn't possible, that's the kindergarten theology of no, you can't prove me wrong. The thing is, the propositions about various gods have been falsified on every occasion where that was possible. When you start talking about, Zeus or Thor hurling lightning bolts, when you start talking about, oh, this God exists, and then you find that it is in contradiction with something we observe in reality, or the theological model, the doctrines contain an internal contradiction, by reductio ad absurdum, that God can't exist. It can't both be true that this God exists. If you believe in a God that makes the sky purple and the sky is not purple, your God doesn't exist. Now, there may be an actual God that you're pointing to, but he doesn't have the characteristics you've described. And that's where we get into real problems, because the truth is, there are as many different God concepts with varying characteristics as there are believers in a God. I don't know how better to demonstrate that gods are most likely things that we have invented than the clear evidence that God consistently agrees with whatever person is representing him at that time. But let's say, just for the sake of argument, that I was tired of going round and round and round on this issue of this is possible until it's proven impossible. Okay, screw it, I'll grant you it's possible that there's a supernatural realm because it hasn't been proven impossible. What are we really saying? We haven't actually demonstrated that the claim is in fact possible. We've assumed that based on the fact that it hasn't been proven impossible. So we're going to begin with the supernatural hasn't been demonstrated to be impossible, and we're going to add absolutely nothing to that, and we're going to expand that to say, therefore, it's possible, and therefore it's probable, and therefore it's true. Adding nothing, we're just going to climb that mountain from not impossible to I'm betting my life and my potential afterlife on it. I am using it to guide my life. I'm trying to legislate my version of this not necessarily impossible thing onto everybody else. And if you don't take this seriously, I don't know what's wrong with you. Aren't you afraid of what might happen when you die? Because it's not necessarily impossible. We have believers who are incredibly sure that a God exists, and when asked to demonstrate this, they want to begin with, well, it's possible, or you can't prove it's wrong, or you can't show that it's impossible, which is a terrible shifting of the burden of proof, a blatantly obvious shifting of the burden of proof. Hey, you believe in God? Why? Well, why shouldn't I? Well, I can give you lots of reasons why you shouldn't. Can you prove there's no God? No, probably not. You'd have to define your God first. And considering that when I ask you why you believe, you started off with why not, I'm not too optimistic that you can actually give me a good description of why you believe and what you believe. And that's one of the big secrets I mentioned last night in a talk. Christianity isn't about Jesus and it's not about the Bible. It's primarily about Paul. And we use Christians use Jesus as convenient supports for some of what Paul has to say. And it's not really about the Bible. It's about personal interpretations of the Bible and attempts to make it relevant. But because these are going to be 3 different talks, I don't want to repeat all of that. When we're talking about whether or not something is possible, that has to be demonstrated. And what's curious is that possibility is pretty easy to demonstrate if something's actually possible. Now, I know, for example, what the odds are on the lottery. They're bad. All of them. They're really bad. I occasionally buy a lottery ticket. When it's $500, $600 million, all of a sudden the odds don't matter. It's worth $1. It may be that the cost benefit doesn't actually tip over until you get to about 900 million for some of them, but at $300, $400, $500 million, I'm spending $1 because I'm an idiot just like everybody else. But I don't actually think that I'm going to win. I think that it's not impossible for me to win. And better than that, I think it's possible for me to win because people win these things all the time. We have evidence for that. I have a set of numbers. It is possible, unless there's something really screwy about one of the balls that weighs too much and it'll never rise. If, under fair circumstances, it's possible I could win that lottery. It's just very, 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 very improbable. And while I will throw $1 away or more on occasion, I'm not betting my life on the lottery. I'm not using these long odds to determine what I'm going to legislate or what I'm going to vote for and impose upon everybody else. So we shift the burden of proof and we play games, and then there's something about they really believe it and they're willing to bet their life on it and they think you should bet your life on it too, and now we're back to Pascal's wager. The not so hidden truth about Pascal's wager, which I exposed in one of the first videos for the Atheist Debates project. Christians don't tend to represent Pascal's wager correctly. Atheists don't either. Blaise Pascal agreed that you don't get to choose what you believe. And he said basically, if you cannot be convinced of this, you should pretend to believe in the hope that this pretend belief will someday become real belief. Is that what's happening when we begin with anything's possible or anything's not necessarily demonstrably impossible and build upon that, adding nothing of substance, nothing but our hopes, nothing but our flawed reasoning to get to, therefore, a God exists and I believe? In everyday language, we might tell someone that it's possible for them to become president. Parents probably tell their kids this all the time. It's possible for you to become president. And we tend to mean that in the sense that we're aware that there are, in fact, people who become president. And if they do all the right things, they may well be one of those people. But we also know that it's incredibly unlikely. And while we can't accurately calculate the probability that any specific individual is likely to end up being president, we can kind of approximate it. We know how many presidents we've had over how much time. We know what sort of steps, how many of them didn't go to law school type thing. We know the types of characteristics, so we can make rough guesses about this, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't tell your kids that you're never going to be president. Maybe you should. Maybe that kind of reverse psychology will encourage them to do all the things to become the president, so maybe I'm wrong. But by and large, I'm not speaking out against hopeful optimism. The idea that we should encourage people to think that things that are possible are possible. Good, go for it. But if we have no good reason to think that it's possible, if our best is, well, nobody's ever shown that it's actually impossible, maybe we shouldn't be encouraging that, and definitely we shouldn't be indoctrinating little minds into that, because that's just pollution. There are those who believe in the supernatural, and they're beginning with it's not impossible, and building it up to, I know that Jesus Christ is Lord. How did you get there? Some people bet very little. Their religion's not particularly important to them. They're kind of hedging their bets. They're doing I kind of believe in that God thing. Maybe I can trick him into thinking I was a really good believer, But, I still drank. Actually, that's not necessarily against all versions of Christianity or any other religion. Well, I would imagine there's some religion where all versions are against drinking, but they're betting potential afterlife. Well, that's a bet that I'm willing to make right now, because I don't think there's any afterlife. I don't have any reason. So I will sell my soul to anybody who wants it. Matter of fact, I would probably sell it many, many times over. And I don't know how you could prosecute me for selling the same thing over and over unless you can actually produce the thing, and that would be worth all of the money I made. This is all based on the mere fact that the idea they're promoting hasn't been clearly shown to be impossible. And they use this reasoning absolutely nowhere else in their life for anything of substance or significance. It is a dangerous form of exaggeration that misunderstands the burden of proof, misunderstands the default position, misunderstands the proper structure of a logical argument, and even sacrifices basic common sense in order to disguise the fact that they don't really have a good reason to believe and must manufacture some air quotes truth from the illusion of possibility. Thanks. All right.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.